All right, so hello everyone to the first interview for the GCAS review. Today we are with Dr. Mark Reiff, who is a political, moral, and legal philosopher whose main interests include economic justice, liberalism, and critics of liberalism, as well as the ethics of war, moral and causal reasoning, and theories of punishment, compensation, and responsibility. Dr. Reiff has published 5 books, including In the Name of Liberty, The Argument for Universal Unionization, Exploitation and Economic Justice in the Liberal Capitalist State, and Punishment, Compensation, and Law, A Theory of Enforceability. The GCAS peer-reviewed journal invited Dr. Reiff to discuss his ideas due to his inclusion in the first GCAS peer-reviewed journal on authoritarianism and power. His contribution is titled, Can Liberal Capitalism Survive?, which will be briefly discussed in the beginning of this interview, with the rest of the discussion concerning his forthcoming book, The Unbearable Resilience of Illiberalism. We are very happy to have you with us today. And to begin, can you tell us a little bit about your paper?
Right. Well, it's inspired by a chapter in Joseph Schumpeter's book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Liberalism, Capitalism, and Socialism. And he has a chapter in that book called Can Capitalism Survive? And at the time, he thought the threat from capitalism was coming from socialism. And he talks about this, and interesting, he decides, no, it can't survive. This was a long time ago, and so obviously he was wrong about that. I thought that he was asking, in a sense, the wrong question. It's not whether capitalism can survive, but can liberal capitalism survive? And so I firmly believe that if we're going to think about the issues we're discussing today everywhere in the world, and issues that, of course, range from economic questions to social questions, it muddles up our thinking if we pack all these political ideas into economic concepts and treat them as one sort of package. And so I think it's important to distinguish between liberal capitalism and illiberal capitalism. And that my worry today is not whether capitalism can survive. I mean, I would be shocked, and I think most people, even who don't want it to survive, would be shocked if capitalism didn't survive. But that doesn't mean there's not a question of whether there might be some fundamental change in the way we think of our societies and how we organize them. So what the paper is about is arguing that we're making a mistake by blaming capitalism, essentially, for the political failings of our societies. And I think those failings are the failure to implement liberalism in the way it should be implemented. And it's a failure to understand it. It's a failure to stand up for it when that's required. We've allowed the right, I think, to sort of set the debate and insist that anyone who's wants political change has to be an anti-capitalist, and I think these things are all wrong. And I think we've gotten in this position, I think, because we've allowed this debate to be run by economists instead of political philosophers, and economists are trained in economics, not political philosophy, and so they're not in the best position to understand how politics and political theory can be used to regulate economic systems. And so the paper criticizes economists for that. It criticizes liberals for essentially ceding this large territory to economists and not really stepping in where they have expertise. And so that's the worry I address in the paper. It's not whether capitalism can survive, but whether liberal capitalism can survive, or whether it'll be replaced by illiberal capitalism, such as fascism or other right-wing kinds of government. So that's kind of the paper in a nutshell, if that helps.
Yeah, thanks. I'm interested because I don't want to label you as anything, because I don't know so much about your political stances, but it definitely seems that you have an understanding of something that most people don't. I think that maybe comes from too much social media or the media in general, where sort of you're either on one extreme or you're on the other. And so one of these questions I have a lot is, what do you think is missing in the current intellectual dialogue that should be understood about liberalism that isn't?
Right. Okay. So great question. So, you know, the man on the street and the women on the street and in academic journals, everybody seems to divide the world into the left and the right. And, you know, of course, it's a sliding scale. You know, some people are on the extreme versions of either the left or the right, but most people are somewhere along this scale. And we think the best way to characterize people or political parties or policies is to put them somewhere on this scale. And I agree that's an important scale, but it's not the only scale in my view. So my view is, instead of just having this one axis that goes left to right, we also have another axis, a y-axis, that goes between liberalism and illiberalism. And what I'm going to do from now on, because the word illiberalism is so similar to the word liberalism, it can be misheard. I'm not going to use that word. I'm going to use the word perfectionism to describe illiberalism, just because then we won't make a mistake when we're listening to what we're doing, and we don't get tongue-tied in talking about them. So I envision this other scale, this second scale, as ranging from liberalism to illiberalism. And okay, so, and like the left to right scale, you know, some people are on the extremes, but most people are, you know, somewhere in between these two. And so my view is that if we really want to capture where someone's political views are, we have to plot them on a graph of both axes. We can't just say left to right. And here's why. So I envision this distinction between liberalism and perfectionism. I think there are two great families of political theories in the world. I call them liberalism and perfectionism, right? Now, within each family, there are many, many disagreements. People are, you know, can be viciously opposed to the views of people in their own family. Wars have been fought about disagreements between these two. But the reason it's important to understand this is what makes these families united, or at least families, is not the specific policy proposals they're going to come up with, but that if we abstract out of it, we try to generalize, we look for sort of basic, what I call fundamental presuppositions that each member of the family embraces. And we look at those, they're very different between liberalism and illiberalism. Again, I criticize a lot of political philosophers for this because they tend now, when they use these words, everybody wants everything to be simple, right? So they reduce everything to a single thing, right? So they say, well, liberalism is all about toleration, or sometimes liberalism is all about equality. And liberalism is about these things, but it's not only about those things. So I have a very thick description of what I think there are about 10 fundamental presuppositions of liberalism, and perfectionism generally believes the opposite of liberalism. And so, and understanding that, I think, is important, because that makes the distinction between the far left and the far right less significant than people tend to think it is, right? They tend to think, well, if you couldn't find people who are more opposite in their beliefs than a communist and a fascist, is the view. But I think this is wrong, because I think fascism is a form of right-wing perfectionism, an extreme form of right-wing perfectionism. Communism is an extreme form of left-wing perfectionism. And while they, on the street, look very different, at this higher abstract level of what they believe is the framework for political morality, they're in a way the same political theory. And this has some explanatory power. It explains, for example, why in Eastern Europe, which had left-wing perfectionist governments, why so many of them have so quickly moved to right-wing perfectionist governments with just a brief stop in democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of the explanation is they're used to perfectionism. They're comfortable with that kind of style, and they're moving from the left to the right. But that move is not as significant as people think. If you were just using the left to right scale, it seems a much bigger deal. So I argue that there are various kinds of explanations. There's various ways in which this other level gives us some explanatory power. I do want to mention a couple of things. So most people, especially since some of the audience will be in Europe, of course, we use the word liberalism to mean different things. And so I want to be clear what I'm talking about. So in the US and in some places in Europe, people think, when they think of the word liberalism, they think we're talking about a sort of collection of policies from the moderate left. And that's not how I'm using the word. I'm using the word, again, to refer to these very fundamental presuppositions about how political morality should be organized, what things are values, how we set priorities between them. And because those things are general, they can be cashed out in various ways. So people can disagree and still be members of the liberal family. So I'm really using it in a much broader kind of children of the Enlightenment sense, not to refer simply to moderate left political parties. So that would mean moderate right political parties are also liberal in my view. And one group that isn't liberal in my view are neoliberals. So I know in Europe, when people use the word liberal, they're often referring to neoliberals. And I have another paper on this. Neoliberalism was originally just an economic theory, not a political theory, but it's morphed into a political theory. But as a political theory, it's a perfectionist political theory, despite the confusing name. And so that's a general framework I have here. And you know, one of the things difficult about talking about all these things is people act as if the terms we're using have very dictionary definitions. You go look them up and then you know what it means, but they're much mushier than that. And so when we have these conversations, we need to be very careful of the terms we use. And so I hope that gives you a kind of idea, or gives the audience a kind of idea of the differences I'm making here and the distinction I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I like how you put illiberalism as a form of perfectionism. It makes sense when those two words are actually put together somehow synonymously. And so one of the things, because the first chapter of your book is titled "Why Illiberalism is So Resilient," or is just so the people and their ears don't get so confused, why perfectionism is so resilient. I mean, yeah, I want to know more a bit about how you see perfectionism maybe enacting itself in politics. Like, are there some certain trends that we should be aware of? Are there certain, you know, attitudes that we should try and reconcile with when we're leaning maybe to the more perfectionist side of things?
Right. Okay. So in the book, I go over all this in detail, but I'll try to do a little quick summary here. So for example, liberals believe in toleration. They believe in government neutrality. They believe in equality. They believe in proportionality for punishment. They believe that that governments should be chosen by an informed public, and that that empirical claims should form the basis of public debate. Perfectionists reject all these things. They think they're dangerous. They think they undermine society. And we can see, considering those elements, how there's a fight between those kinds of elements. And the big fight, I think, is liberals believe in pluralism. Liberals believe that there are a wide variety of reasonable conceptions of the good and plans of life that people can run their affairs on, and that as long as those conceptions are reasonable, government should allow people to do what they want. Perfectionists, in contrast, have a very rigid, comprehensive conception of how people should live a moral life. And they believe that the role of government is to ensure that society is composed solely of individuals who embrace that particular conception and abide by it. And so if you think about that, lots of things flow from that. For example, if you're a perfectionist, you know, there's no such thing as dissent, right? You can't dissent within a community because the community is defined by people who agree with this specific comprehensive set. So if you disagree, even in the smallest way, you're an enemy. And we can see that going on all around the world. It's, you know, to use Trump as an example, since he's a good example for almost everything now. Yeah, I mean, it was probably shocking to people that Trump has turned on his most loyal, I'm going to use a slightly derogatory word, his most loyal toadies. It doesn't matter how loyal they were, how hard they've worked for him in the past. If they just say anything to criticize him, he turns on them. That's typical of perfectionists. Perfectionist societies turn on their own eventually and eat themselves up, whereas liberalism gives some space for them. So that's one area where we can see this kind of thing happening, because, you know, other aspects obviously are, you know, this idea that society is somehow, this idea that society must be somehow pure and that we can purify society. And this is the same concept. Who comes into the pure society definition varies between which society we're talking about. But it's, you know, color, gender, sexuality, you know, ethnic history. There's a long list of qualifications of who you have to be one of the people who count, or at least one of the people who count more than other people. And obviously, those attitudes are becoming very popular now among certain segments of the white population. They claim they feel threatened. And so they're turning to these ideas that justify their desire to conceive of themselves as superior beings than other people. And we can see that all over the world. That's happening in the US, it's happening all through Western Europe, it's happening through Eastern Europe. In some various obvious ways. And so what's going on today is a battle, I think, between liberalism and perfectionism. And the point of the book is to help people better understand why that's the battle, not the battle between the left and the right. So I'm trying to help them understand how to think of this struggle and what they can do to be more successful, because I think liberals have been terrible at defending themselves so far.
That's really an interesting point for the next question to end on. So when you have the left and the system of beliefs that they prescribe to, and you have the extreme right and the system of beliefs that they prescribe to, while they're disagreeing with each other quite a bit, they're sort of also agreeing on the fact that, well, we can both go against liberalism. I think that there's a fear, and that fear has some misconceptions that if they could easily be stated, the person might be able to go, no, maybe I'm right, if they're a rational person in anyway. But I'm interested, what are the misconceptions that left and right have about liberalism?
Well, that's a great point. And so, I mean, one of the things which you pointed out that I just want to emphasize is, if you look at things that way, you realize that left-wing perfectionists, people who are trying to move us into some conception of socialism, are in a way undermining what they want to achieve. They want to make society more just, but given the infeasibility right now, given the political climate of governments becoming socialist governments, what they're actually doing is helping to undermine liberalism and promote right-wing perfectionism, which is where the threat is going to. And so, and it also means, again, if we don't look at the world simply as between the left and the right, we realize that just because someone is on the left doesn't mean they're right, even though we're on the left, right? We have to think where they're also on this liberalism perfectionism scale. And here's some of the mistakes they make. So one of the claims you hear a lot, even from people on the left, who are really left-wing perfectionists, is that liberalism is obsessively individualistic. All liberals care about is the individual, and that liberals care nothing for the community. They don't think communities are important. And since communities are important, I think that's obviously true, you have to reject liberalism, is one of the claims. Now, I think this is wrong. It's a misunderstanding of liberalism. It may be true that some liberals think that, but if they do, they're misunderstanding liberalism too. Liberalism does not say that communities are unimportant at all. What liberalism says, and this is one of the things that distinguishes it from perfectionism, is that liberalism says that the fundamental social unit is the individual. Perfectionists say the community is the fundamental social unit. So what does that mean? Just because the individual is the fundamental social unit doesn't mean communities don't count. Communities do count in liberalism. They count because communities are important to individuals. They count a lot. So it's not a case of, you go all one way and not the other. Liberalism does take the value of community seriously. And so there's no reason why we have to reject liberalism if we care about the community. Perfectionists, on the other hand, think the community is the fundamental social unit. And that's why, for example, people can be sacrificed for whatever the overall perfectionist goal is. That's not a problem if you're a perfectionist, if you believe it's the community, not the individual, that matters. Perfectionists believe that people are like, they're not individuals. They're parts of a single body, like cells in your body. And so, for example, if you have, a growth somewhere that you don't like, you don't talk to it to try to make it go away. You just cut it off. And that comes from this intellectual conception of where we're starting in the moral world. Is it the individual or the community? So that's one big conception that I think people, if they like the community, even though they wouldn't agree with the perfectionist conception, they think they have to reject liberalism. That's just wrong. They can afford it. Another important one is that a lot of liberals seem to believe that liberalism is just a tool to implement capitalism, and therefore you have to reject liberalism if you're an anti-capitalist. Well, this is also wrong. You can have liberal capitalism, or you can have illiberal or perfectionist capitalism. That's what my paper for your journal is about. But you can also have liberal socialism or illiberal socialism. Traditional state-sponsored socialism is illiberal or perfectionist. Some people believe that you could have democratic socialism that is really socialist rather than capitalist. I doubt that, but it might be true. Some very impressive thinkers believe that's possible. And so that's an option. But again, the liberal perfectionist conceptions can be added to either capitalism or socialism. So again, it's a mistake that some left liberals make, thinking they have to be anti-capitalist. And so that's a big problem. Some right-wing liberals think also that if you're on the left, it means you necessarily have to reject capitalism. And this is also a mistake because, again, as I just explained, you could be capitalistic and be liberal too. And so, again, that mistake drives some people who really are on the liberal right to the extreme perfectionist right, because they think if you're liberal, you have to reject capitalism. Again, that's not true. And there are many others I go through in the book. So clearing up some of those misconceptions, I think, is important because there's been a lot of baggage added over the years to these ideas. And sometimes there are examples of where people who think of themselves liberals carry this baggage, but it doesn't mean that to be liberal, one has to do that. Just like anything else, these are very general categories and one can implement them well or badly. And like everything in life, most people, are so-so in the way they implement things. They make a lot of mistakes. And so thinking clearer about those mistakes allow us to focus on what we're really fighting about and not some odd proxy. So that gives you an idea, I think, of some of the things I discussed.
Yeah, I guess now I'm sort of wondering. All right, there's a chapter in your book, and it's a subpart. It's part of chapter 2. What counts as an argument in the battle between liberalism and perfectionism? And there's a section called the need for an agreed conception of the good and shared understanding of the nature of truth. And I guess this sort of goes to your work, understanding causal and moral reasoning. And if there is going to be a reconciliation, let's say, between the perfectionists on the left and the right, what sort of basic truths should they be able to agree on fundamentally so they can maybe, let's say, keep their identity as how they choose to be a political actor while having a fair ground to play on, let's say?
Okay, well, so it's not that I think we need to worry about how left-wing perfectionists and right-wing perfectionists can talk to each other. They can talk to each other because they all believe in these the same fundamental presuppositions. They cash them out in very different ways. So they could talk to each other. They don't want to talk to each other because one of the perfectionist beliefs is that negotiation and compromise is for wimps. The only option is conquest or capitulation if you're a perfectionist. So you got to completely crush your enemy or give up. Those are the only options. So what we're interested in doing, or what I'm interested in doing, since I am liberal and I'm distressed by the idea that the world is becoming more perfectionist, is I want to explore the idea of, if we're trying to argue, if a liberal and a perfectionist are trying to argue, what they're trying to argue about essentially is which framework for political morality they should embrace. So that section of the book explores the possibilities. That's what I mean by what counts as an argument. Easy example is, liberals often seem to say that, accusing someone of being a racist is the worst thing they can say about them. Well, not if one's a racist. That's a compliment, right? I mean, it depends on whether you think racism is wrong. If you think racism is right, you say, thank you, right? That's what I'm trying to do. That's the whole point of what I'm trying to do. And so liberals often don't realize this. They think everybody's operating within the liberal framework. And so they think, okay, well, all I got to do is call someone a racist. And they'll see, it'll be self-evident to them about why their views are wrong. But that only works if that person is a liberal. If they're a perfectionist, they reject the idea of equality. They believe that white people, for example, are the superior race. And so that claim has absolutely no purchase. You know, the liberals forget that accusing someone of not being a liberal is not a criticism if you're not a liberal. And what you have to do is you have to argue for the reasons why you should be a liberal, not simply just illustrate that you're not, because that doesn't convince anybody. Maybe I should mention here, there's one great example of this from the first Trump election, right? So I live in California, and in California, up to that election, the Clinton-Trump election, Clinton's campaign was running a bunch of TV commercials, you know, obviously being to encourage people to vote for Clinton. And the commercials were simply videos of Trump saying outrageous things. And, you know, he's got a lot of outrageous things. So, you know, it's a long commercial. A lot, you know, he says racist, anti-immigrant, anti-gay. I mean, just, you know, everything you can imagine. And that's it. The pictures of him saying that. And then at the end, it says, you know, paid for by the committee to elect Hillary Clinton. And if you're a liberal, that commercial is going to be effective because it's going to make clear that Trump isn't a liberal. But if you're not, or even if you're just not sure, that commercial was almost like an advertisement for Trump because it had no argument about why these things were wrong. No argument whatsoever. It just acted as if this was self-evident. And as I think we can see from the events unfolding around us, is this is not self-evident. These things need to be argued for. And so that's a problem. So I go into this all in that section of the book. What I mean by conception of the good, so one of the ways to argue with people, obviously, on a moral basis, is to say, what you want to do will have really bad effects. And the word bad requires some definition, right? Because people have different conceptions of what bad or good might be. That's what's referred to when we talk about a conception of the good. And if my conception of the good is that everybody is treated equally, and your conception of the good is that white people are superior and deserve to be dominant, well, then I'm not going to be able to argue that, look, if we do what you want to do, white people will be superior, because then you'll say, yeah, that's the point. That's what I want. That's my conception of the good. We need to argue about that conception of the good to get anywhere. And I go through all the ways we might argue about that. And I reluctantly conclude that there is no way to argue about that. That's why liberals and perfectionists find themselves talking past one another so much, because these fundamental presuppositions from which we each begin are so different. There's no way to make an argument against someone who rejects those count, right? That would just be begging the question. You can't assume your set is the right set in that argument, because the issue is which set is the right set. And so you have to find some way of arguing about that. And I've been thinking a lot about this. I mean, these issues, they started in a paper I did in 2007. And I've been thinking about this ever since. And in 2007, I was kind of hopeful that I would ultimately be able to find a basis on which liberals and perfectionists could argue with each other. But after all this time, I have to say I've come to the conclusion that there is no basis there. Now, remember, most people are not at one extreme or the other. They're somewhere in the middle. And so it is possible for people in the middle to argue with each other because they sort of have some of the same presuppositions, and that you can argue with them. So what I'm talking about are the people on the extreme ends, can't talk to each other. And even this isn't a problem if the groups at the extreme ends are small enough. But my worry today is they've gotten bigger and bigger, and they're getting sufficiently bigger that we can't just ignore each other. And so the first chapter, that first chapter you're referring to in the book is pretty pessimistic. It basically says we really can't intellectually engage each other because the choice that's really driving our views was made at a pre-moral time. We can only use morality once we've made those choices as to which set of presuppositions we accept. And so there's nothing we can say. We can argue with each other if we're in the middle, so it's not hopeless. But I guess the point of that section is the bigger those extremes get, the more hopeless it becomes. And so that's what I try to explain in the book, why I think that.
Well, to talk about the extremes getting larger and larger, and losing, I guess, a sense of morality, if I get it right, towards the others, is based on an identity that person or that group wants to fulfill. And I'm curious what you have to say about identity politics in general, and then also how political identity can either reinforce a person's idea of authenticity or and reinforce it either positively or negatively, we could say. For example, I guess if someone was, let's say, a very good liberal, that would be something authentically good in these cases. But for the identity politics of the extremes, what do you think is sort of a problem they're not seeing for themselves that makes them lose a sense of morality?
Well, okay, so again, this idea of what kinds of arguments we should do. So that one chapter says, okay, we really can't argue with each other. We can't use moral or rational argument against each other. I do suggest at the end of that there are still things we can argue. There's still realms in which we can meet. I suggest that aesthetics is one of those, so we can still make aesthetic arguments. And I also suggest that we can make theological arguments. And one of the things I argue for is that religions need to do as good a job of defending liberalism as they currently do defending perfectionism. And they can do that, and they have done that in the past. And so we can rely on those kinds of things to argue between the extremes. Okay. But so we still have a large group of people that are not on the extremes, they're in the middle. And those are the people who we can make arguments to. And so the next chapter of the book is what kinds of things can we say? Now, liberals are often accused of playing, which is a derogatory term, identity politics, right? That they argue that who someone is more important than what they've achieved or what they've done or could have done or any of those kinds of things. And it is true. I talk in the book about sort of the history of identity politics, and it is true that liberals do focus on identity as a way of explaining why, for example, the principle of equality has not been met. I mean, obviously, you cannot implement the principle of equality unless you identify what is supposed to be equal. And so it's a necessary component of that argument that identity has some importance. But especially today, I think people often forget that for most of the history of the world, the group practicing identity politics was white people. I mean, we just call that politics now, right? But it's actually identity politics, because it's about, you know, keeping white people and white privilege as the dominant sect in most nations. So left-wing identity politics is a reaction to right-wing identity politics. It's not something the left is inventing. And when we think about that, you know, there are different moral rules that determine what you can do in response to a wrong by someone else versus what you can just do, you know, if you're not responding to a wrong. I mean, we do this all the time, right? Throwing people in a cell and locking the door is a moral wrong unless it's done as a response to some wrongful behavior by the person you're doing that to. So I think when the left is engaging in identity politics, it's perfectly justified in doing this. It's absolutely appropriate and in fact necessary if we're going to instantiate some liberal values. But liberals do a very bad job of reminding people that the only reason this is appropriate is because white people, or certain groups of white people, have been practicing identity politics for so long. So they do a bad job of that. The other thing they do is they fail to recognize or take into account the fact that practicing identity politics on the left, even though it's completely justified, has some bad side effects. And you know, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. We take drugs all the time that cure diseases but have bad side effects, but we don't pretend they don't have bad side effects. We try to identify what they are so we can deal with those separately. And so I think that's where liberalism is failing now. It's failing to take into account how the practice of identity politics on the left, through its misperception, is driving or supporting this idea of tribalism. That's what's most important, is your identity, and it's helping to drive people to the right. So again, I don't think these side effects warrant abandoning identity politics, but I do think they warrant broadening the kind of politics one engages on the left and the kinds of attitudes. So I think so I propose a couple of things that we should broaden our focus. Instead of liberalism being instead of it being susceptible to being accused of being only about identity politics, we should be about some other things. Here's other ways of implementing the same ideas. So if you look back historically, when we first started actually trying to implement the idea of equality, the test used in this country and other countries as well to determine whether something was being implemented equally was whether it had a discriminatory effect. Okay, so if you were hiring police officers and whatever it was on the test that people had to pass meant that only white officers were making it, that was a discriminatory impact, right? Now, in resistance to this, white people argued that this is unfair. Lots of things can have a discriminatory effect, even though it's not intended. And so that the proper test should be discriminatory intent. You should have to prove that something which has a unequal impact was intended to favor one group or another. And that's now become the test. And this is problematic because it means that people are now first of all, it's almost impossible to prove. Among other things, I used to be a lawyer. And so let me tell you, it's very, very hard to prove intent. Because it's happening in someone's head. You know, you don't have a video of that. And so no matter what someone does, they can always, come up with some excuse for it. So it's very hard to prove intent. And it also has the effect of everybody's about labeling people, right? If you're called a racist, or if you're found to have violated the discriminatory intent test, you're going to feel bad about this, and you're supposed to feel bad about this, and people don't like to feel bad, so they resist this vigorously. So my view is we go back to the discriminatory impact test. This argument no longer has to be so vicious. It no longer has to be so personal. You can just say, well, that's the way things worked out. You know, lots of things happen that way. We don't have to blame you for being a racist or for intentionally discriminating. We just say this is a discriminating impact. We have to fix it. And I think that would reduce the tribalistic reaction to that. The other major program I talk about is taking the idea of reparations seriously. And by reparations, I don't mean simply identifying the descendants of people who were slaves, or, for example, or were, you know, gypsies, or were, you know, deprived of something through a historic injustice. I think we should do that too, and when we can do that, we should compensate those people. But I'm talking about the sort of overall incremental effect of all these kinds of historical prejudices that have led to huge imbalances in wealth in the world. And so what I propose is a sovereign wealth fund, which would give everyone, even those who were deprived of capital through historic injustices, a share of the benefits that capital generates. And this is not in lieu of other kinds of reparations. It's in addition to them. The idea is to look simply at whether people start again. It's designed to think that people who do not have capital today do not have capital, at least in part, due to these historic injustices of what other economies. So they may be white people too. And so if we have a sovereign wealth fund that benefits all these people, we are to some extent correcting that. And since we're not simply saying, well, only Black people get this, or only some other kind of people, indigenous peoples get this, we may give them special compensation, again, if to the extent we can do that for specific wrongs. But this in general gives everybody a share in the wealth of a part of which has been unjustly accumulated. And so I think pushing for that, rather than simply pointing out identities, is more effective, because the only identity that really matters there is whether you're poor or rich. And I think people can get behind that more easily than they can any other version of identity.
Yeah, I mean, can you go a little bit more into the sovereign wealth fund, and maybe because, right, people have universal income now is a very hot topic, hot topic, right? So maybe can you describe some of the differences between the two, what you like, what you don't like about universal income, and how your sovereign wealth fund is doing something that the universal income isn't doing?
Right. Okay. So great question. Yes. So I actually have a lot of worries about the universal basic income proposals. These have been around for a while. Started as kind of a right-wing idea, and then it came in as kind of a left-wing idea. It started with Milton Friedman, right-wing economist, and then was really sort of moved to the left by Philippe Van Parijs, a left-wing political philosopher. And I have to say, Philippe has been, for his entire life, basically, vigorously pushing this idea, despite the fact that for the first 20 years or so it was around, it absolutely had no purchase on society. It was just totally ignored. Finally, it is now beginning to have some. So Philippe deserves a lot of credit for that. But my worry is that we might think of it as a Trojan horse. So universal basic income, the idea is everybody, no matter what, there's no test for this, everybody gets some amount of money, usually monthly, and to do with no strings attached, to do with whatever you want with it. Okay. You know, at first you say that, people say, gee, I would like, you know, a nice little check from the government, you know, just that I can, and that's true, and that's appealing. It was originally come up as an idea to address poverty, right? And it does do that to some extent, maybe. But one has to remember that, you know, this money doesn't just come out of thin air. It has to come from somewhere. And actually giving people an amount of money that would significantly change their lives is enormously expensive. It would require huge tax increases to fund. Now, I don't think there's wrong with huge tax increases. I think taxes need to be a lot higher, but people resist this. And so there are implementation problems, right? It's going to trigger a lot of resistance. People say this is really expensive. And the other thing it's going to do is people are saying, well, look, if we're giving you all this money for sending you a check for, you know, $5,000 each month, why should you also get subsidized housing and, you know, aid for extra children and all these kind of other social programs that we've established? Indeed, some of the people who advance the UBI argument say that another advantage of it is simplification. We can get rid of all the social safety net. We just give people a check. I think this is a problem. This is what I mean by Trojan horse, because my worry is that if UBI was to catch on, the price would be reducing or perhaps even eliminating the social safety net entirely to compensate for the cost of this. And of course, even if we did that, there would still be extra costs. So it would still be very expensive. And this is not good, because, I mean, unless you're prepared to say, hey, he got a basic income check and he, you know, blew it on cocaine, and the fact that he's dying now, that's his problem. He can't pay for medical care. He shouldn't have done that, right? Well, I don't think we're prepared to just let that person and people like that who have spent their money unwisely die on the street. So that's a real problem. So it's not true that it's a substitute for the social safety net. It can only do good if it's a complement to the social safety net. And my worry about it is the people on the left who support it today seem to almost universally act as if it would be a complement to the social safety net. That's just kind of assumed. But I think that's politically naive. It just would not happen. It would be a substitute for the social safety net. And that would make the people on the left, that would mean that the people who, those on the left are trying to help through UBI, simply, they would be made worse off. So I think if you're politically realistic, UBI is really a right-wing proposal. And it wouldn't do the good people think it would, because there would be other adjustments which would undermine that altogether. Now, so why sovereign wealth fund? So sovereign wealth fund differs because in UBI, you get a set amount each month, and it comes from tax income. You tax essentially rich people, and you give, and that money comes from then goes to the right. So basically, the government is just acting like a redistributor in there. Okay. So what's a sovereign wealth fund? Well, a sovereign wealth fund is a fund, like a hedge fund, that invests in stuff. And if it's well managed, it makes a profit. And the idea of a sovereign wealth fund is those profits then, not the principal, the profits are distributed to everybody. And so there's technically no set amount each month, depending on how profitable the fund is, you might get more or less. In good years, you might get a lot. In bad years, you might get nothing. So it won't pull people out of poverty in the way UBI would. But it also won't justify replacing the social safety net, precisely because it doesn't come in every year. And so what it does really is it equalizes, as I was talking before, it equalizes access to capital, right? Most people don't have any capital. They have a negative net worth. But if you have a sovereign wealth fund and you get a check from it, it's as if because you have a share in this fund, you now have some capital. You might be able to borrow against it to do things. And you do, if it's well run, and all the sovereign wealth funds today, they actually do generate money every year. It varies in amount, but it's usually significant, and it usually goes up. So you are getting money to people, and the money is not it's not coming simply from taxing the rich. It's there in the fund, and the fund itself is generating income. So now you think, okay, well, the money, the seed money, the original money has to come from somewhere, right? So where does it come from? There's this old joke by John Paul Getty. Someone asked him, how do you become rich, Mr. Getty? And he said, okay. And he thought about it. He says, well, you got to get up early, you got to work really hard, and find oil. And he's absolutely right. That's how he got rich. And of course, if you find oil, it doesn't matter whether you get up early or work really hard. And if you don't find oil, it also doesn't matter. So finding oil was the lesson. And of course, most of the successful sovereign wealth funds today are established with oil money, right? They're in the Middle East or in Norway. And so people haven't taken this seriously because they think, well, look, if you don't have oil, you can't seed it. But that's not true. There are lots of things. There are lots of ways in which the rich now hold wealth that they acquired unjustly. Doesn't mean all of their wealth is held unjustly. Doesn't even mean that most of it is. Some of it is. Very modest statement. And so if we have independent reasons to tax that wealth because they shouldn't be holding it. And again, we're only taxing a percentage of it, small percentage. And so if we add in together various taxes like that, if there are various things that we think are wrong, like profiteering during the pandemic, most people think that's wrong. And most people think people who did that should be taxed for it, regardless of where it goes. I think people should be taxed for that, regardless of where it goes. But I also think it should go into the sovereign wealth fund, and from various sources, outsourcing jobs to other countries, importing goods made with slave labor. These are all things which are bad to do, and we should tax if people make profits on that. And we can simply add those taxes into the sovereign wealth fund. And then, of course, once the fund has enough seed money, it just invests in stuff and makes money itself. So I think this is realistic for most capitalist societies if they are willing to tax unjust wealth in a very small amount.
I want to piggyback on the joke about wake up early and go find oil. Now, okay, oil in a way has been recreated into the internet, let's say. So now if you want to get rich, you wake up early and you do something big on the internet. So really this question has two parts. One is, what is the viability of perhaps a sovereign wealth fund from internet, what's the word I'm looking for? Moguls and the internet, the high elite of the internet. And the second idea would be if you could say something sort of about the idea of social corporatism that's coming around too. But first, more importantly, I guess, is the sovereign wealth fund, but not from oil as in Norway or the Middle East, but from the internet companies.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I think they should be contributors to this fund.
Yeah.
Now, again, we're not talking about confiscating all their wealth or anything like that. You know, we're talking about maybe an initial significant payment, but after that, only a small a payment. But let's think about this. Now, people think this is anti-capitalistic, but it's not. So capitalists believe in a free market, right? And a free market is a perfectly competitive market. And in a perfectly competitive market, everything, and I mean everything, sells for the cost of production. Economists tell us on the right and the left this is not a controversial claim. So profit is only possible when the market is not perfectly competitive. And of course, no market is perfectly competitive. At best, most markets are imperfectly competitive. Some are not, some are monopolistic and not competitive at all. But one of the ways you can tell how the degree of lack of competition in a market is how much profit people are making, right? Because if someone's doing something that's making a lot of profit, other people are going to see that and say, "Ooh, that makes a lot of profit. I'm going to go do that."
Mm-hmm.
And they're going to compete. And so, and everybody will keep being attracted in. And as they're attracted in, there'll be more parties doing it. So the price will come down. And so profits will come down to a reasonable level. When that doesn't happen, the only possible reasons are there are barriers to entry to the market, meaning there are artificial obstacles that prevent people who say, "Ooh, I like that amount of profit. I want some of that." There's some obstacle preventing them from going in, either because they don't have the access to the technology, or they don't have the access to the capital, or because they need someone else to give them access to the internet, but they can't get it. And barriers to entry are anti-competitive. And so if you're a capitalist, you believe in bringing down barriers to entry. So that's a problem. The other possibility, if people aren't entering the market, is that the people who are in the market have got together and conspired to exclude new entrants. And that's a crime under most nations' antitrust laws. So by definition, almost, people who have extreme amounts of wealth have benefited in some way from either monopolistic power or imperfect competition. And if we're capitalists, then we should tax that, because that's not anti-capitalism. That's what makes capitalism work. In fact, it's anti-capitalist to suggest that people who have done that should keep all that stuff. That's anti-capitalist. And so, so what's happening today, when we have, you know, this group of 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, I don't know how many, internet companies who control this asset, and essentially, given their size, they have monopolistic power. They can prevent new entrants. They can, because everybody needs access to their resources to even enter the market. This is something which is wrongful, and we should stop it. But at the very least, what we should do is tax a little bit of it. And given the sums involved there, that would make pretty good seed money for a sovereign wealth fund. So, so there are lots of areas like that where we can see that people who have accumulated wealth have accumulated at least a portion of it. I'm not talking about seizing it or even taxing large portions of it. We're talking about a little bit of tax. Mm-hmm. Clearly, that's justified, and that would fund these kinds of things. Now, so the social corporatism, or socialist corporatism, I think you said, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so, okay, well, this goes back to my point about what do the words capitalism and socialism mean? And just as people have tried to add a lot of political baggage to capitalism, baggage that I say is not inherent in capitalism, it's that baggage comes from a form of illiberalism. And what really is going on is people are not defending liberalism successfully, and that's why that baggage is being added. Socialism, it also has lots of baggage. I mean, people on the left tend to say, well, everything that's good is socialist, even though, you know, the history of at least state-sponsored socialism is not so admirable. Lots of problems there. So how do we think about these terms? Again, I think we need to be very careful when we're using these words in arguments like this, that we're clear about what we mean by them. And the only way to get clear on our thinking here is to think of capitalism purely as an economic system that can be joined with any political system. Capitalism, you know, believes in a free market, and that most means of production are privately owned, and that prices and quantity decisions are set by the market. Socialism, again, I think for the purposes of the discussions we're having here, and for like-minded discussions, we have to think of it also as simply an economic system that says prices and output decisions should be made by central command, and that all means of production, or at least all heavy industry, and probably a lot of everything else, should be owned by the people, which really means being owned by the state. And so those are the two economic decisions. But people often use the word socialism to refer to, you know, a caring government. Well, but that's confusing, because, I mean, I think government can be caring, but let's not use the same word to describe that as we describe this competing economic system, because then when we advocate for socialism, when we're really just advocating for liberalism, we get tagged with all the baggage that the economic system has attached to it. We don't need that. And so socialist corporatism is not socialist in the economic sense, not at all. It's socialist in a sort of caring community sense, but it would be better, I think, if we were more careful in the way we use those terms. It's not socialist. It's a kind of social democracy in the sort of European sense. Most European countries have a social democratic party. They're not socialists or capitalists. They're not as hard-hearted as certain other capitalists, right? That's the difference. So I think socialist corporatism in that sense is very interesting. And here it contrasts to neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is a descendant of economic liberalism, a more general concept that supposedly started by Adam Smith. And neoliberals claim that Adam Smith said any interference with the market, you know, is bad, and it's an infringement of freedom, and it undermines economic efficiency. So we shouldn't do that. That's not what Adam Smith said. Adam Smith said nothing of the sort, but that's what neoliberals claim he said. There's another group of economic liberals who also think they're descended from Adam Smith, and they're mostly or exclusively, I guess, in Europe now, and for Anglo-American audiences, they wouldn't have heard of them, but these are the Ordo Liberals. And there's a wide range of Ordo Liberal thinking, and just as there's a wide range of neoliberal thinking, but the Ordo Liberals say, okay, yeah, we care about freedom and liberalism in being able to do certain things, but we believe in the free market. And sometimes that means preventing government interference so people can do what they want. But private parties can interfere with freedom too. It's not just the government that interferes with freedom. Private parties can do that too. And in the economy, they do that when they engage in monopolistic behavior or fraud or any of these other kinds of economic crimes. And so in those cases, government regulation is essential if we're going to preserve freedom. And so social corporatism is this idea of how we bring all these supposedly opposing forces together to to administer essentially corporate wealth. And economically, it's been very successful. It was responsible for Germany's, rise from utter destruction to one of the great economic powers in the world. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And indeed, Germany's more recent problems seem to stem from their abandonment of that original idea. So I think social corporatism is a good alternative when it's done right and taken seriously. I think probably just in Europe, because there's a tradition of this now, whereas in the United States and Britain, well, maybe not, maybe even in Britain, but in the United States, it's probably not an alternative, given that we've taken a different path, and sort of getting onto the European path would take a lot of effort. Whereas in Europe, they've strayed a little bit, but it's just we're nudging it back. So it's probably a better alternative in Europe. But of course, like everything else, it can be done badly or well. Mm-hmm. And so it's no guarantee that things will work. And but it's an interesting solution. But again, it's not socialist. It's capitalist. It's a kind of capitalism with a view as to how we take into account other people's views. And that's what liberalism is all about, taking into account other people's views. Perfectionism is about excluding everyone who doesn't agree with us. And so we don't need to take other people's views into account because everybody has the same view.
Yeah, that sort of gets back, because we'll have a couple more questions. And the first one of the last couple addresses your final chapter of why things are likely to get worse before they get better. And I want to sort of hit on two things. One is what sort of run-of-the-mill people can sort of expect to see in the future that will happen, that they should be aware of. And then second, what are maybe some positive things that might exist, if there are any?
Okay, yes. So I'm afraid the book is pessimistic. It argues that if you're on the extremes, you can't talk to each other. There's no hope for that, but there's a little hope. But it's this very indirect, theological argument or aesthetic argument we have to use. When we're talking about, curing some of the big problems today, like economic inequality, unemployment, doing something about the unequal distribution of wealth, healthcare, all these kinds of things. I mean, actually, these things are pretty easy to fix. It's not that we don't know how, although, it's no guarantee. I mean, things can have unintended effects, but we've got the tools to make big progress in this area. The question is whether we have the political will to use them. It's the political will that's missing there. And I have some arguments about why I think, the ways in which I think we can be more persuasive in motivating people to support the political will needed for that. So I have some arguments about that. The why I think things are going to get worse. Okay. So I think if we have any lessons we can draw from history, I think we can see that for a liberal country to become a fascist country, for example, or a perfectionist country in some way, even if it's not technically fascist, it doesn't need a majority of the people to support that. Throughout history, of course, that would do it if you had a majority of the people supporting it, but throughout history, fascist or perfectionist regimes often rise with less than majority support. Indeed, in the US, this is what's happening here, right? Because of the odd rules in which power is allocated in the Senate, small rural states have the same vote as states that have huge numbers of additional people. And so I think the statistics, I can't remember them quite, but I think soon, I think by 2025, 70% of the people in America are going to live in just 16 states, which means 30% of the people get all the other states and get to elect 2 senators each, and therefore get to control the government. That doesn't sound like democracy. So anyway, so I think history tells us you don't need a majority. History also tells us that 2 or 3 or 4% of people who are hard extreme perfectionists can be dealt with and tolerated. That doesn't threaten the continued existence of a liberal society. So what that means is that there's some percentage between that very small, 2 or 3% level and something less than a majority that signal that we're really in trouble. Now, where is that line? I wish I could sort of give you a more informed view as to where that line is. What I can tell you is that my gut says it's about 20%. That when 20% of the people in a community reach that extreme perfectionist stage, we're in trouble. And I'm not sure I can explain why that's my gut feeling, but if I'm right about that, then a lot of places are getting very close to that tipping point. They're either just about there or just over it, and that's a problem. And so part of my pessimism is that I don't know where the tipping point is. But my worry is we're getting very close or may have already passed it. So 2 things. I think since we don't know where it is, we should behave as if we haven't reached it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we want to take, in a sense, we want to act like optimists but be pessimists. So in other words, we would act like we would if we thought we were okay, but recognize that we may very well not be okay. Because we don't know where it is. And there are some things we can do. Again, we're not going to move people who are already at the extreme back, but we are going to be able to battle for that group in the middle, which is a big group. And I suggest in the book all sorts of various ways we should do that. So I believe we should do that. We should behave as optimists, even though I think we have reason to be pessimists. Now, the reason why I think things are going to get worse before they get better is my worry is that we are over that tipping point. And that if we are, I don't think it's possible to bring us back by the liberal methods of discussion and respect and negotiation and compromise. I think, again, if we look at history, the only thing to shake us out of that is that only happens when there is some very devastating cataclysmic event, like a war, possibly a pandemic. It's possible that the pandemic may do this. The end of the book discusses the possibility that that's the event. And I'm not arguing that this is something we want or that we should contribute to or that would be a good thing. I worry that it's unavoidable. And I think it's a very bad thing. But if it is unavoidable, but I think it would be a mistake not to consider the possibility that it may be coming. Because that encourages us it encourages us not to see the problems we have now and to discuss them with the degree of concern that they deserve. And, you know, I know I say this and a lot of other people say this, you know, we're re-experiencing the 1930s.
Mm-hmm.
And people say, oh, no, it's nothing like the 1930s, you know, there isn't a great worldwide depression, although, you know, that's maybe debatable now in the pandemic, but let's go with that. Let's say, okay, it's not like 1930 in that sense, not that bad. We don't have people like Mussolini and Hitler running around. Again, we have some people sort of like that. I mean, Trump is a lot of ways like that. But let's give him that too. And so it's not as bad. And so people who are claiming it is are just being alarmist. Well, okay, so here's the pessimist in me talking about this now. So I think we have more reason to be concerned now than we did in the 1930s. Why? Because in the 1930s, there hadn't been Hitler or Mussolini or World War II yet. There wasn't that historical example of what these things lead to. And so one can see, I think, that, you know, especially the way perfectionists always appeal to people by saying, oh, your life is going to be wonderful if you just support me, everything you want is going to, you know, happen, you know, we're going to be, what did Trump say? We're going to win so often you're going to become tired of winning, right? This is, you know, typical perfectionist pitch. So maybe there was reason to believe that people could be more easily seduced by those kinds of claims. But today, we've had the 1930s. So I think things are worse today because we're experiencing much the same thing, despite the fact that we've had the experience of the 1930s. That's really alarming because it's suggesting that there's some kind of attractiveness to these views that is so powerful that it can overcome even this horrifying experience of the 1930s. So that worries me a lot, and so I am worried about that. And again, not that I think this is a good thing or that we should want it to happen to sort of clear the decks. I think those are awful things, but it doesn't seem to me. There doesn't seem to be anything good to come by not judging the moment rationally, historically. And I think optimism now is not rational, although I continue to believe we should behave as if we're optimists.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
I mean, that sort of, I think, is really what leads to the final question. And so, right, in the introduction of your book, you dedicate it to Oscar Schindler, Hugh Thompson Jr., and Joseph M. Darby, and as you say, whose special talent was being able to have normal human reactions in abnormal circumstances. When others were behaving like pigs or remaining silent, they cried out and did something about it. When the time comes, may we each live up to their example. And so, discussing this, think optimistically, but rationally understand that the world is in a very pessimistic period. What is something that each one of these gentlemen, or that they collectively share with each other, is sort of an attitude or an approach to life that a person living now can take and use for themselves?
Right. Well, great. Great question. Okay, so let's talk about them a little bit. Why them? Okay, so I assume I don't have to say much. Excuse me. I assume I don't have to say much about Oscar Schindler. Everybody, I think, probably knows who he is. You know, through the Steven Spielberg movie Schindler's List. That's Oscar Schindler. There's a book by an Australian author who the movie was based on. I think it's Thomas Keneally, I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, who wrote the book. And Schindler's a major historical figure, so lots of people know about him. So I won't say much about him, but Hugh Thompson Jr. and Darby are less known. So in case people don't know, let me give a little bit about what they did. So Hugh Thompson Jr. was a helicopter pilot during the American Vietnam War. And one day in March or May of 1968, I may be getting the dates wrong. He's flying over a village in South Vietnam, and he sees dead bodies everywhere. And they're not, the bodies are not of bodies of people you would ordinarily think of as North Vietnamese or Viet Cong combatants. They're old men, old women, children, infants, in some cases, all over the place. He sees there's an American platoon in the village, and even though they've killed hundreds of people, there are still some people left, and the platoon is in the process of hunting them down within the village and shooting them. And so Thompson sees this, and he orders his door gunners to train their weapons on the Americans. And he announces to the Americans that if they didn't stop what they were doing, he was going to order his door gunners to fire on them. So they stopped, which, I mean, if you really think about it, that's kind of an amazing thing. I mean, he must have had, the presence he must have had to say that in a way that people believed he would do that, and that his door gunners would obey that order and open fire. I mean, that's pretty amazing. But they stopped. That was the village of My Lai in South Vietnam. So it's the famous My Lai massacre, which he stopped. Unfortunately, not until it had killed a lot of people, but he saved quite a few as well. So he stops it. He goes back to base and he writes an incident report about all this, which not surprisingly is suppressed. But eventually, and I think it takes about a year, it gets leaked to an investigative reporter named Seymour Hersh, and he publishes it. And so that's why we know about the My Lai massacre. And eventually, some of the participants are charged and convicted of their role in that. Now, Darby he was a reservist in the military police unit in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. And that was the most notorious prison under Saddam Hussein, and someone in the American government, I often, when these things happen, you always want to know, I just want to talk to that guy and think what he was thinking. He decided, oh, this would be good. We'll keep that prison and we'll use it for our purposes, right? They'll keep the most infamous, prison operating. Anyway, so there are these prisoners in there. Some of them are high-value detainees, people suspected being, terrorists or members of Al-Qaeda or something like that. This military police group there was, it's hard to know exactly all the details, but they were sort of encouraged to soften up the prisoners. And they did this by engaging in all sorts of really brutal, inhuman things. They made, the men pose naked with women's underwear on their heads or stand on each other. Or, they just did awful things. Of course, they didn't think these were awful. In fact, they were proud of them, and they took pictures of what they had done. And they were so proud of it that they circulated these pictures even to people who weren't involved. And Darby was one of these people. And he was appalled. And so he wrote an incident report about it and included the pictures that had been circulated, and he sent it up the chain of command. And again, it's completely ignored and suppressed for a while until, again, it's leaked to Seymour Hersh, same reporter, and comes out. And so then we know about what happened at Abu Ghraib. And again, some of the people who participated in this were actually charged and convicted. Okay, so they each did similar things, but so one of the interesting questions about all this is why? What made these people capable of doing what I think a lot of us think of as heroic acts after the fact? What makes them capable? What kind of people were they? How could they have done these things, right, in those circumstances? Let me flip back to Schindler here. So Schindler was often asked this, because he was interviewed, for years and years, and people always asked him, how could he have done this? Because, again, he didn't seem like an exceptional man in any other way. He wasn't a very good businessman. He started a lot of businesses after the war. They all failed. He was kind of a drunk. He just didn't seem particularly impressive, to have a particularly strong degree of moral fiber. And so it was mysterious to people. How could someone like that do such a great thing? What made him able? And he was always asked about that, why we do it. Usually just ignored the questions. And then finally, I guess he got tired of hearing this question. Someone asked him that, and he answered. He said, well, people were behaving like pigs. One had to do something. And you could see the disappointment on the reporter's face. That wasn't a very good answer, they thought. I mean, they wanted something like, oh, when I was a child, my father had bought me an ice cream cone, but it fell on the floor, and a Jewish shopkeeper gave me, one for free, even though I didn't have any money. They wanted some sort of pop psychology story about what gave him a special motivation, right? And this didn't fulfill that, so they just, I think people just didn't take much notice of that answer. But I think it was the perfect answer. Think about it. People were behaving like pigs. One had to do something. Obviously, right? I mean, Schindler did have a special talent. And his special talent, as I say in the dedication, was being able to have normal human reactions in absolutely extraordinary circumstances. Because unfortunately, in extraordinary circumstances, most people put aside what would be their normal human reactions and just stand there. And I think that same explanation is behind what Hugh Thompson did and what Darby did. I mean, they both received death threats after this. I mean, Thompson, I think before he died, it took about 30 years. He was finally given a medal for doing this, but it took 30 years. And it was a medal, it was a non-combat medal. I can't remember what the title was, but it was really kind of a left-handed compliment. And Darby's been, trolled and villainized afterwards. But so what did they do? Well, they had, their great talent was having the ability to have normal human reactions, because their reaction, of course, is totally normal, right? And they just follow through. And in every other way, they were ordinary people. And so to end on an optimistic note, I think that says something optimistically. What it says is all ordinary people have this great ability within them. And it's the ability simply to have normal human reactions in extraordinary circumstances. And if they can do it, we can all do it. And so I guess the optimistic part of my book is that I think there are such people. And these are only three. I mean, there are lots of other people in history that I could put in there too. So there are people like this. And I'd like to think that in the right circumstances, more of these people would rise up and do these kinds of things. And so that's the most hopeful note, I think, I can end on.
And I think that's a beautiful note to end on.